Hello, this is Hayden Roberts, your instructor for World Regional Geography this semester. This is the first of several PowerPoint slide presentations that should help you understand what we are covering over the course of this semester. I've broken this roughly down by chapter, but also by topic or topic areas based on the reading material. Geographic studies are an important area of academic discipline. They are a discipline that's been around since the time of the ancient Greeks, so several thousand years. The importance of geography is to help essentially understand how humans and physical features interrelate. Geography is a human creation. It's not something that naturally occurs, although natural occurrences in the geographic landscape help to determine how humans create regions around the world. There's other factors, not other than physical, that go into that, which will kind of be the major focus of what we're talking about in this presentation. So what is geography? It is a discipline under the social sciences, typically, though sometimes geographers cross into the area of the humanities. For example, my research work tends to be more human or humanities related as I talk about history in my writings and research. I've done work on, for example, county fairs in Oklahoma and talking about why people still attend those particular events. So that becomes more of a humanities type of study, whereas other geographers will study things like water flow or how economics is determined by the relationship between multiple countries or two countries. So geography is a wide path and a wide variety of areas that are studied under this sort of umbrella discipline. The discipline itself really divides between two areas, physical and human geography. The human geography, typically people specialize in areas like economics, culture, society, history, other things that deal with human interaction. Physical geography, as it sounds, deals with the physical landscape. The discipline of geology, which deals with rocks and other kinds of formations, typically under the ground, originated from the physical geography field and sort of spun off into its own field as technology allowed for scientists to look under the ground as opposed to just looking at the physical features above the ground. The thing about geography is we always think of it as being a discipline completely dominated by maps, and certainly maps are important to geographers, but not all geographers use maps, or they certainly use different kinds of maps, which I'll give you some examples here in a minute. In addition to maps, there's other data that is provided. For example, in my own personal research, I've used what's called ethnography, which is observations of the landscape, a technique that oftentimes anthropologists or folklorists will use in their research. Another kind of source is to simply interview people, either using surveys in a social science way or a humanities way to just simply do recorded interviews with open-ended questions. In addition, economic data generated by economists or accountants or lawyers, in other words, political data, also can be used as people deal with geography and geographic kinds of subject matter. So geography provides an understanding about place. Essentially, if you want to think of the world as a big gigantic space. And when I say the world, I'm using the term the Earth. Certainly the study of geography can be extended into the cosmos, into studying other planets or other places in the galaxy or literally the universe. But typically geographers are not concerned with issues outside of the realm of the Earth. So the word world can be used interchangeably almost with the Earth when we talk about this kind of subject matter, because we're specifically talking about the geography of this particular planet. So the Earth, or the world, is a kind of space that we occupy, and as humans, and certainly other animals, have a way of defining their particular place. You think about whales having migratory patterns that tie into their mating habits, or you think about migratory birds like ducks and geese. They themselves have, or monarch butterflies, they themselves have places that they live and also places that they originate, and they define them as two separate ways instinctually. Humans, though, take that to another level and talk about place as a way of sort of carving up the space that we live in into usable destinations or usable regions or usable areas. Location is very important to the study of geography, and we create location really almost arbitrarily, but we certainly do it, if not arbitrarily, at least subjectively. We create these different places around the world and give them names, and in that in turn creates locations. Latitude and longitude is a term that is, I'm sure you've heard of. Oftentimes they can be mistaken in terms of what they represent. I'll show you a diagram to kind of explain them in a second, but they again are part of this place carving that occurs in humanity. And certainly longitude and latitude are very important in terms of the technology of GPS, global positioning systems, and making our smartphones allow us to find locations and receive directions. So that's the value of those. Distances and directions are another way of thinking about place. Objects on the Earth, oftentimes we think of them in relation to other objects. For example, the state of North Carolina is North Carolina as opposed to South Carolina. That's creating a understanding about place, two different places based on their relationship to each other. The direction from one to the other. One is north, one is south. They both represent a region called the Carolinas, or in the central part of the United States, the Dakotas, but divided between North and South Dakota. You also find, when you think about distances and directions, we think about larger areas where, this is a world regional geography class. When we think about the East, that is a term that often refers to places like China and India and Japan and countries around there, versus the West, which represents places like the United States, the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe. And in fact, the direction and distance between those are really based on a ancient, literally going back to the time of antiquity, ancient relationship between Western powers like Rome and Greece versus Eastern powers like Iran and Babylon and Japan and China and India and so forth. A distinction between Europe and Asia as being Europe the West, Asia the East. Scale is another way of thinking about place, and scale, is really refers to map directions, and I'll show you a diagram here in a second. The last way of thinking about place is a sort of evolving or emerging technology called Geographic Information Systems, GIS. I know you know GIS because you see it every day. You turn on the local news channel and watch the weather. The weather maps that are set in motion are a GIS technology. There's other ways of using GIS. You actually can even use GIS to map the human body, but it was originated in the 1970s as a way of mapping the globe, basically moving cartography, an older mapping tradition, into the age of technology, the age of communication, by digitizing information, putting it into a spatial or visual representation. That's essentially what maps are, visual representation, and then using that as a research tool. This is a diagram that I mentioned that kind of gives you an understanding about what latitude and longitude is. Latitude excuse me, goes from the center of the Earth, meaning the equator of the Earth, all the way up to the North Pole. So the latitude, so we all represent different latitudes, and certainly usually weather patterns are based on latitude. Whereas longitude moves around the Earth, almost like if you can imagine time zones. So you could say latitude is the weather, as a way of remembering what latitude is, and longitude represents time zones, although time zones don't exactly follow longitude. They start at the prime meridian, which runs through England. That's how it started, but then it are incremental sections that run around the world, and most of the time zones kind of fit within each of the major longitudinal lines. When you talk about projection, maps are projections. They are visual representations of the world, and it's hard to represent a round or sphere on a flat surface, and so different maps are used to help represent different places on the Earth. And these projections that are shown in this slide give you a sense of how projections can be used. Different projections serve different purposes. For example, the Mercator projection is a great projection to use when talking about political maps. However, when you start talking about physical geography, as you move closer to the poles, geographic features start to get spread out, because that's the purpose of this map, is to deal with mostly political boundaries moving closer and closer to the equator. The further away from the equator you get, the way things get spread out. Therefore, oftentimes when you see a Mercator map, you'll notice that Greenland, the largest island in the world, looks bigger than Australia, the biggest continent, when in fact Australia is about 2 or 3 times the size of Greenland. Same thing is true when you look at a Mercator map and you see Antarctica, which looks like it extends bigger than Russia, and in fact it is a little bit bigger than Australia. So other projection maps can be used. However, projection maps at a very local level can create challenges for creating straight lines, and so you'll see unprojected maps. The example is Texas and the United States. Kind of gives you those two examples on this screen, show you how if you want to use straight lines, which are very important for local surveying reasons, or for maps that are for travel, road maps, it's better to have, because you're on a local level, those kinds of global projections don't really matter in a very narrow or local area. Therefore, you can flatten things out or change the projection for the use of the map. This gives you a little bit more information about scale. One of the things that becomes very complicated in understanding scale is that the larger the scale, the more detail you're going to find in a map. The smaller the scale, the further out you move. So it's almost, in effect, inverse from what most logic dictates. In more advanced geography classes, I would actually test you on this. I won't test you on this because it is a confusing element, but it's something to sort of keep in the back of your mind as you go through the readings, that scale works in this particular way. And scale is important, as you can see from these 4 examples of downtown Boston, how different layers of scale will provide you different information. The thing about maps is maps are designed for their use. So each map has its own particular function and only provides enough information to serve that function. So in the case of these maps, you don't see any geographic or physical features. Everything is drawn out into lines because that's what's important. This is a driving map. And then depending on if you're trying to find directions in downtown Boston versus the suburbs of Boston, you would use a different map because, of course, you want to have different relationships or different understandings to certain roads and physical features or landmarks and so forth. So geographic regions. Geographic regions are highly subjective and are constantly in flux, and they are certainly something that changes even within the same context. And I think a great example is I teach this class using 3 different textbooks depending on the group that I'm working with, depending on the institution that I'm working with. And what you find in these 3 different textbooks is 3 different interpretations, or really 2 different, but certainly different interpretations about what defines a region on a global level. As I said, regions are spaces. Regions are spaces of places. They have multiple characteristics that go into them. They're dynamic and they're often changing. People create regions. They remake them. Lots of things go into defining a region. And so the regions that we deal with in this class certainly are constantly in flux, but they are also fairly stagnant based on relationships of people. You're going to find that when you look at the regions in your book, the regions are not always in line with the continents. I'm going to have you learn a little bit more about the way continents and oceans operate around the world later on in this class, but in the immediate, understand that regions sometimes cross continental lines, and some continents, actually like Asia for example, can be divided up into multiple regions. Part of these distinctions go into the difference between what it means to be global versus local. Globalization is a big sort of hot term that's multiply or oftentimes discussed in our communication age. Because of the information age that we live in, the internet, television, other kinds of, the fact that you can make a satellite call from the top of Mount Everest, it speaks to the idea that we are interconnected, even if we've never visited places around the world. Migration also adds to this. It used to be that humans, during prehistoric times would migrate in small clusters around the world. In other words, they might migrate like, the way that monarch butterflies migrate from North America down to Mexico and back as part of their life cycle. Shorter distances. Now we see migration occurring on a global level. People from Syria, or people from China, or people coming to the United States, people from places as far south as South America finding their way into Europe is not uncommon in this day and age. With this comes a lot of changes globally. We have a spread of ideas certainly in technology, which is great, but also crime and disease are some of the negative things that go with globalization. Economics, the price of oil, the price of gas at our pumps here in the United States are directly related to the way that oil is pumped out of the ground in the Middle East. On the flip side, we may live in a globalized world, or globalization may certainly be becoming a dominant concept for us. We still live in a very localized world. In Oklahoma, our world is, still, can be defined by, neighborhoods and communities that we live in, city identities. But in other places in the world, places that are more tumultuous in terms of politics, not the United States, but places such as for decades, Northern Ireland was divided into political factions based on religious identity, but also based on ethnic identity. The religious identity was, of course, Protestants versus Catholics, but within that there's ethnic identity between the Irish or Celtic ethnic identity versus the Scotch or Welsh/English identity, which is the Protestant side. You have separate groups that create localized environments, and interestingly, while we see a lot of globalization occurring, you also have seen in recent years countries divide into smaller partitions. The country of Sudan, one of the physically one of the largest countries in Africa, has divided in half over the last 5 years. You see a country like Yugoslavia in Eastern Europe that in the 1980s was one complete country, had been that way since the end of World War II, but because of unrest among ethnic populations, divided itself into 5 or 6 different regions or countries. Eventually it started out as states and then eventually countries, and so that creates some differences. The other thing to keep in mind is that even though, for example, the United States trades globally, Saudi Arabian oil comes into the United States, Chinese manufactured goods come to the United States, Canadian lumber comes to the United States, you still have local interaction on an economic level. Our closest trading partner for the United States is still Canada for geographic reasons. Mexico would be second, but then you have other countries like China that come in very close after that. But here in a place like Oklahoma, our economic tie is strongest towards Texas, where there are major metropolitan areas that we interact with on a corporate level, on a retail level, on a personal level in some cases. So the slide shows some different ways of thinking about measures of globalization. The one thing to keep in mind is that not everybody is globalized at the same level or to the same degree. Here in the United States, as we have a higher connection to technology, our level of globalization is much higher. In places like Africa, where technology or access to technology is a challenge, even having consistent phone access is a challenge, their level or connection to globalization is much leaner, much less developed. The way people move around, migration creates more globalization or more global connection for people, as opposed to people who stay in the same place for generations. And then, of course, countries have different levels of economic development, which I'll talk more about in the next presentation. The United States is a very wealthy nation, and so therefore our globalizing relationship, our emerging globalizing relationship, is directly related to the fact that we have a lot of economic interests worldwide. So major world regions. As I said a few minutes ago, different books that I teach out of divide the world up into different regions. For the most part, there's a lot of similarities or a lot of consistency in some of these regions. Europe, Russia and its kind of neighboring countries, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, which is Indian area, the sort of subcontinent of India, in North Africa and even kind of the Middle East, are all pretty consistent areas or regions. Places like Australia and New Zealand are sometimes lumped into Oceania, which is sort of a non-continent. If you think about all the islands in the South Pacific, which includes Australia, the islands around Australia, they sort of represent their own cultural divide, but yet Australia kind of is different than those other islands, but yet it's kind of the same because it's divided away from Asia. And so some textbooks will break down these regions so that Australia and New Zealand are one region because of their former relationship to being a British colony, but then Oceania and Antarctica, which is not regularly habitated by humans, except for scientists, it becomes its own separate thing. But there's different ways of thinking about it. Latin America is another great example. Latin America really kind of begins south of the Texas-Mexican border because of Mexico's relationship to the former Spanish Empire centuries ago. Latin America is usually dominated by mostly its relationship to Spain, former historical relationship to Spain and Portugal, but then there's other colonial interests which we'll talk about as we get into these regions that separate these areas out. And in some cases, textbooks will divide it between Latin America, between South America and Mid-America, or Middle America, which is really kind of Mexico, Central America, all the Caribbean islands as being a separate region from South America. And so in North America, typically when we talk about regions, even though there's the continent of North America, which goes from the top of Canada all the way down to the Panamanian-Colombian border, as a region, North America usually is just simply Canada and the United States. So here's a map of the way some regions are divided out. You can see how there's a lot of different kinds of regions in places like Asia, whereas North America really is pretty similar. It's pretty static in terms of its divide between two areas. Another example, this is from another textbook, you can see that Middle America is divided out from South America as a separate region. You also see in places like North Africa or the Middle East, it extends up into places, parts of Russia, and there's kind of a dividing area through the Sahara Desert in Africa between that kind of North African region, Middle East region, and Sub-Saharan African region, that sort of area in the more tropical parts of Africa. Europe stays pretty much the same. East Asia pretty much the same. South Asia or India, the Indian region, and then Southeast Asia also is pretty much the same between these two. If you kind of look between these two, you can kind of see similarities and note the differences. Okay, so the study of regions, as I said, or the study of geography, really goes back to the time of the ancient Greeks, who were fascinated with different cultures that they came in contact, ones that they conquered, ones that they were at war with, and their early maps really reflect those kinds of issues. So oftentimes we think of older forms of geography being physical geography. In other words, let's break down geography into physical locations. And in fact, the study of geography really starts out on the human side. It's about human geography. It's about where do people live. That's the interest that the ancient civilizations had with geography, or even all the way up till the time of the American Revolution. The interest in geography really was more about human contact. The British colonial powers in North America sent surveyors, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, out to survey areas. Certainly they wanted to know where land was, but they also wanted to know where the Native American populations are, particularly the ones that were not particularly friendly to British and French expansion across the continent. But you also see, with human geography, understanding about, particularly during the Middle Ages, is when you start to see documentation of property. Where do property lines begin and end? Nobles, property holders wanting to know that. Kings want to know where their kingdom ends. Before that, it was pretty open-ended in terms of understanding, the relationship between ownership and physical land, but that is another area where human geography sort of trailblazed before physical geography really became a more important sort of tool for maps and so forth. This is an early map. This particular map dates to the time of the High Middle Ages, but it is a copy of a map that's much older, that dates back to the time of Ptolemy, who was the emperor or the king ruler of Egypt after Alexander the Great. So Ptolemy was Greek, but he lived in Egypt, lived in Alexandria, which was the capital of Egypt at that time. And this map is a reflection of how the Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks, knew or understood geography in the world. This is a very flat map, and so as you can see along the left edge, you can see where Europeans get this notion that the world ends, because it was literally understood that if you continued to the west far enough, you would drop off the edge of the earth. They didn't understand that the world was spherical, it was round. Certain scientists over periods of time indicated that that was true, but popular understanding was that the world was flat, and this map reflects that. It also reflects this map reflects a lack of understanding about physical geography as a science, and about weather, which I'll talk more about the next presentation, is geography based on weather or climate change or climate patterns. You'll see these kind of fuzzy smudges around the edges of the map. If you look closely, they actually have faces. These are the different winds of the earth, reflecting ancient beliefs about the gods and their impact on weather conditions. That said, this map is surprisingly accurate in certain places. You can see the boot of Italy, you can see England, you can see Ireland in this map, you can see the Nile, as well as the different changes in what they call cataracts in the flow of the Nile River. You can see the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Indian Ocean, and many of the major rivers, the Indus River, for example. And so, while there, is a limited understanding about geography in a global context, the local geography was actually surprisingly accurate. And the more, if you notice, the closer you get to Greece, or the closer you get to Egypt, that kind of Mediterranean Sea area, the more detailed and accurate the map is, reflecting the more local considerations, or local knowledge was more robust, obviously, than the further out you go. The further out you explore, the less knowledge is available. The big island towards the lower right-hand corner is actually Sri Lanka, or Colombo, and off the coast of India, and that island is much smaller than that. But again, they knew it was there, but not knowing how large it was geographically, because of their proximity and not having as much information, having not traveled there specifically or necessarily. Something other to think about when we talk about regions of the world, the divide, for example, in the Western Hemisphere really comes down to between North and South America, or Latin America versus North America as regions, really comes down to different political circumstances that have occurred over the last few centuries. Latin America really, as I kind of highlighted, is essentially a colonized area of the world, colonized for a long period of time. Even after Spanish and Portuguese dominance faded, you still have the British and the French interests continuing to thrive in different parts of that world. That's part of what creates Latin America as a separate place other than North America, where while Canada and the United States were colonized by the British and the French, they received their own level of independence from those European powers early enough, or in surprisingly different ways, to create a different kind of region or a different kind of economic relationship between Europe than Latin America has. Wars, of course, changed the global environment and therefore the regional environment. This kind of gives you a map. This is a colonial map of the world, dating back to around 1914, which would have been around the start of World War I. And you can see, this color coding of this map. You can kind of see where different areas were dominated by the influence of certain European powers or regional powers, the Chinese regional powers, for example, but colonies really that play a role in, or the colonization of particularly Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and South America, Latin America, really play a large role in the division of some of these regions. And we'll talk more about them as we hit these regions, why some of these this is significant. So that's the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, certainly email me or call me and let me know what you think. There'll be more information provided in upcoming presentations, a second presentation that deals with the general Earth as a whole, again dealing more with physical geography, but then more regional presentations as we move through the different chapters of the book. Thank you.